Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Esoterica. I'm Leah Eichler. I'm here with our managing editor, Sue Cato. And today we have the really distinct pleasure of interviewing Nathan Greenfield. Nathan Greenfield is coming to us from Ottawa, and he is the author of this fascinating new book called Hanged in Medicine Hat. Put it over there so everyone can see it. Hanged in Medicine Hat. Nathan, welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you for having me.
So many things to discuss in this book. We almost don't know where to start. But first, a little bit about you. I mean, you were born in Brooklyn and found your way to Canada. How?
Well, I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. I came to McGill at 78, 79 as a visiting student, and I returned in 1980 as a master's student, married, stayed, got my PhD, and I taught for 30 years as well as being a writer. And at this point, I've written 7 military histories, a true biography of the artist Marlene Bruno Bobak, and I'm the international North American reporter for the University World News. I publish on education, usually 2 or 3 articles a week.
Wow, you are one busy man, and really, I guess you could live nowhere better than near Ottawa because you are such an expert on military history. So, I mean, let's dive in. Hanged in Medicine Hat. There was, as a lifelong Canadian, there was so much I didn't know about, and I thought I knew quite a bit about our role in World War II. But there were these Nazi displacement camps in Canada. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, there were a couple of dozen POW camps. So New Brunswick and Quebec, where Man in His World is now in Montreal was a POW camp. There was one in Kingston, Ontario. Fort Henry was used as a POW camp in both World Wars. And the 2 biggest were Medicine Hat and Lethbridge, Alberta. Medicine Hat chosen because you couldn't really get anywhere if you escaped. There was only a small road in, there was the railroad, easy to monitor. And if you escaped in the summertime, you would die of thirst, basically. And if the wintertime, well, like today, you'd die of being frozen to death. Right. Might have gotten a bit further, but similar situation.
Fascinating, and I mean, and we'll get to the crux of the book in a little bit, which is the mass hanging that took place. But just to kind of lead up to it, describe what it was like having. I mean, the POW camp was almost the size of the town, correct?
Yeah, basically the size. The town was about 15,000. The POW camp was about 12,000. It was inside of the city limits. It's where the Medicine Hat Stampede ground is now, and it is a. Actually, they got along relatively well, the 2 groups. Medicine Hat wanted the POW camp for the jobs, and it did provide jobs. And the POWs were very well treated in town. The senior POWs, there's only 1 officer, but the senior POWs, NCOs, were allowed what were called parole walks. That is to say, they were allowed to walk around town in uniform, which was what must have been an odd sight the 400 times you saw it, and on their own, on their parole, that is to say, on their word. That they would not try to escape. And basically, there were no cases in Canada of parole walks turning into an escape attempt. In terms of the camp itself, the Canadians interpreted the Geneva Convention quite liberally. For example, the Germans, who on the whole, in quotation marks, flashing lights, followed Geneva for Western POWs, that is to say, Americans, the British and the Canadians and Australians and New Zealanders, not the Russians, because the Russians never signed Geneva. So that's an entirely different situation. But in any case, stay with the Western POWs. On the whole, they followed Geneva. I can give you 1,000 examples where they didn't. One of the kind of contentious issues is POWs are supposed to be fed the same amount of calories, essentially the same food, as nearby garrison troops. Now, what the Germans did is they counted the Red Cross parcels as part of the calorie intake. We did not. So the Red Cross parcels were in addition to, I think it was 3,500 calories per day, with the result that they put on weight. In the first 2 years of being POWs, most of them put on 20 pounds. Which is quite different than the situation in Germany, and I should say, for having written a book on POWs in Japan, entirely different. That is again a different issue. Japan never signed the Geneva Convention, so, which is not to excuse what the terrible conditions. It's just it's an important legal difference.
Right.
And of course, people like to laugh at this one in terms of the POWs. Not only did they run their own show within the wire, that is to say, within the fence, the encampment, as per Geneva, but the Canadians, Eaton's, produced a special catalog so that they could order chocolates to send to their families, as well as lingerie for their wives or lovers.
Wow.
So very odd.
Let's so these POWs in a POW camp in Medicine Hat, Alberta, could order chocolates for the loved ones, chocolates and lingeries for loved ones back home.
Yep, shipped through Turkey or Sweden.
Now, how unusual was this? Because I read your earlier book, The Reckoning, about all the it's the opposite side with Canadian and British prisoners in German camps. Was this going on there?
No. The Reckoning actually POWs in the First World War. And it's no, it was not going on there. They in Germany, it mattered very much in both world wars who your commandant was,
right?
What the camp was near. So in the case of the Reckoning, several of the camps were near salt mines, so the POWs were forced to labor in salt mines. Some things like that did happen in the Second World War, but fewer. Of course, we were on the winning side. So even though Canada had rationing, we never really needed it. There were no food shortages in Canada. Yeah. And that was one of the reasons why the POWs were sent here instead of having them in England, where you'd have to ship food to them in the convoys. So the issue of food in Canada was that we also followed Geneva to the letter and more, in the hopes that the Germans would thereby treat our POWs well.
Right.
Now, I've never seen a document showing, from High Command in Germany saying, well, they're treating our guys well, let's give them a big Christmas dinner. I've never seen a document. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist or didn't exist. Are there examples where the POWs could say that, having had news of, let's say, a Christmas dinner, for example, things improve for a period of time? Yes, there are some examples of that. Is there a cause effect? We don't know.
Right. I mean, just fascinating. So, I mean, the way Canada generously interpreted the Geneva Convention in favor of these POWs, did it lend itself to the environment in which these they govern themselves, which kind of snowballed into the events?
That's a very good question, and actually, the way you put it actually leads me directly to a very clear answer. Yes. Yes, and the Geneva Convention and the War Measures Act in Canada both stipulate that POWs are to basically run their own show within the wire. So there was a fence around the camp with the guard towers that you see in Hogan's Heroes. And then there was a wire, literally a wire, about ankle high, about 10 feet from the fence. If you stepped over that wire, you could be shot.
Okay.
So the area within the wire was considered by the Germans and to some degree by the Canadians as German-run territory.
Uh-huh.
That allowed, in certain camps, a Gestapo, it's called, to grow up or to form. And they took the legal idea that they're running their own show. They elected their own. That's in Hogan's Heroes. Hogan's Heroes may be campy and funny, but it actually gets that right. If you think of it, Colonel Klink never issues an order to a POW. He tells Sergeant Schultz, Schultz tells Hogan, Hogan tells the next one, and then the order goes. Right. So the POWs, and this was true for our guys in Europe. because not all of the POW camps were in Germany. So they ran their own show, and the more Nazified the camp in the States, the easier it was to control it, because the high command in the camp ran the show.
Right.
Now, what happens in Medicine Hat is in the first murder of August Plazek in 1943, they were actually looking for someone else, the command, the Gestapo. They wanted to find who was a defeatist. And they were interviewing a bunch of guys, and all of the ones they were interviewing are Africa Corpsmen. So that's very important. But the Africa Corps was defeated, Rommel's troops. They were shipped to Canada. So the majority of the POWs were Africa Corps, or at least a large number, who were never really trusted by the Germans, because even though they were excellent fighters, the French Africa Corps, they had taken an oath to the Africa Corps, which they then broke to take their oath to Hitler.
I see.
After the fall of France.
Yeah.
So the logic was, if you break that oath, why should we trust you with this oath?
Right.
So they were never really trusted. So they were looking for a defeatist. There were a number of men who were interviewed, and one of them, Schultz, not Sergeant Schultz, but his name was Schultz, breaks away from being taken to another place to be held for further questioning and runs towards the wire. A couple of thousand men start following him, because everyone knows what someone running to the wire is. You step over it, put your hands over your head. The Canadians have their guns trained on the group, who stop at the wire, and the man is taken to Canadian custody and is considered a traitor. So they were then going after Schultz. Schultz gets over the wire. Another group sees Plazek and goes after him, pulls him into another hut, and hangs him. So that was essentially a riot, and should have been tried under the Riot Act. It wasn't, although the prosecuting attorney, who was Attorney General of Alberta, actually said, I'm going to try this group, as though it were the Riot Act, but I'm not going to use it, and never explains why. And that becomes an issue in the trial. In the second murder, they have to move out of Medicine Hat about 1,500 POWs, because they have the men who captured in Normandy in 1944. So they choose the most Nazified, or amongst the group 1,500 are the most Nazified, and they know who they are. They get, the night before they're sent out, they murder Carl Lehman, whom they suspected was a traitor. They did not know it. In fact, he was. So that's sort of thing. And then that trial is, they just say nothing about the Riot Act, and that one is straight single trials, as is the first. The Judge Housen, Mr. Justice Housen, the Attorney General wanted to try them as group, and the judge severed the trials. So we have three trials and 4 or 5.
So these POWs were living, if I understand correctly, in kind of the gray zone between autonomy, war zone mentality, and also subject to Canadian laws. So so that kind of has this perfect storm. I mean, they hanged their own for being traitors, and then Canadian law enforcement moves in, and then this trial happens.
Right. Yeah, well, a long time later in 1943, because the first murder is 1943, the trial is 1946. It's not broken until after the end of the war, when an anonymous letter is left on a typewriter in another prison camp, naming names.
Okay.
That allows them to break it. They more or less knew, but they couldn't prove it. So they never brought charges in 1943 for the murder of Plazek in 1943 and Lehman in 1944. They had a pretty good idea. In the end, they actually tried some other men than they thought were going to be most guilty.
Right.
Yes, you're quite right about the gray zone. So you never, and this is true, when you are POW, when our POWs in Europe, and as again, as you see in Hogan's Heroes, they remain men at war.
Right.
And at the same time, they are subject to the Geneva Convention, or it's the umbrella, and subject to what's called metropolitan law, which means the law of the place you are in. So it is quite a gray zone. And it becomes grayer, especially for Lehman, after the bomb plot fails to kill Hitler, and he issues the order that all traitors are to be killed. A summary court-martial, and kill them. They had heard that on their shortwave radio, which was hidden in it. Well, at least one of them was hidden in a model of a ship.
Right.
And so they were then under orders to kill any traitors. And so that comes up at the trial. Which law are you under at any one time? So
it's such a can of worms, you can imagine. And I think, you get into this a bit, the reluctance on the part of the Canadian government to start that prosecution at all, much less to kind of follow through with.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't seem overly anxious, especially the Plazic one. But they continued, investigating. I have thousands of pages of their documents, their investigations. But no, it's a can of worms, exactly. And even in 43 and 44, they may not have wanted to bring charges. That's because, of course, we still have POWs over there.
Right.
By 45, our POWs are freed, and they bring the charges, and the trials then occur in 46. So it's but there is the gray zone is quite gray, and in a similar case that occurred in South Africa, that the Canadians were well aware of, because the men who were charged with the murder were sent here and were investigated here and then shipped back to South Africa to stand trial. The judge there ruled that this gray zone, as you refer to it, is unnatural, and you can't, because they were found guilty and sentenced to death also. But the judge removed the death sentence because he said that they are they were in an unnatural situation, and they were under orders of their home government, which still existed.
Right.
To act.
Right. Fascinating. So let's get to the trial. Tell us a bit about the trial and how that was received at the time.
There were some very funny moments in the trials. I'll start with that. First of all, it's a trial in front of 6, not 12 jurors, because trials in the West at that point occurred were 6, not 12, simply because of population. And they had good representation. The POWs, paid for by the Canadian government, very senior lawyers were given. So you can't make an argument about the representation that way. Some of the funny moments in series of the early trials, for Plazic, that first, and then 2 months later, the Lehman, the POWs, one of them is caught kissing his thumb instead of the Bible. And Judge Howson sees this and blows his top. And after a very interesting and funny exchange, he says, "There shall be no thumb kissing in my court." And one of the POWs says he won't kiss the Bible, but he will take his oath on the sword because he's a German. So there was some interest. You can, especially with the thumb kissing one, you can imagine this jury, which was made up of, the regular men in Medicine Hat, whom we can assume were probably church going, or at least most of them would have been given the time period. That kissing your thumb instead of the Bible must have caused more than a few eyebrows to rise.
No doubt.
Yes, so.
Now in the trials, there's an issue that comes up again and again, more so in the Lehman trials, but it's also in the Plazic, of homosexuality in the camp. Now, I want to stress, I am not the slightest bit interested in whether or not, prisoner A was having sex with prisoner B. That's a sociological question that is not mine.
Right.
But the trial, what's interesting about homosexuality in the trials is it was used by both sides. There was no question that there were homosexual trials of Germans by Germans. It was called the degradation ceremony because homosexuality, as it was for our law, was illegal. And so they would march the men out, rip off his epaulets, and afterwards a whole bunch of men would come beat him up, sometimes almost to death.
Wow.
But the Germans defended that, and the Canadians turned a blind eye to the beatings, but knew about the degradation ceremony. That shows the perseverance of German law.
Right. Interesting. So that's,
so homosexuality was used by the defense to show that the men were still under German law.
Right.
By the prosecution, that is to say, the Crown, it was used to show that you have this working Gestapo in the camp, which is cruel and unusual.
Right. Interesting.
So it gets used to, each side uses it, but for a different purpose. Now, looking at it from our point of view, the first one I explained, that
Right.
is to say, the perseverance of German law, is probably the one we would accept as the more logical legal argument.
Right. So
But that's me saying it. Now the book was read by a retired Supreme Court justice, and the legal sections were read by other lawyers.
right.
And I was given the thumbs up on the legal aspects that I talk about.
So I understand how it would be used by the defense. So how was it used by the prosecutors?
They used it to show that there was in the camps this illegal, because Gestapo was illegal in Canada, cadre bent on spreading German law, spreading German ideas within the camp, and if they could get out outside the camp, and they killed, which is against Canadian law.
Right. See, interesting. And there was also the case of one of the accused who was hanged being a pedophile. Correct?
No, so that's the other man who's executed the same day.
So how did he become how did that happen on the same day?
There was a wonderful memo. The executions were supposed to have occurred in the first trial, let's say June 12th.
Mm-hmm.
Canada's hangman, who there's only one, Claude is his name. I know his real name, but it's usually not used. He was busy that day. So there's this wonderful memo saying the executions can't occur on June 12th, that we moved to July 3rd because the hangman was otherwise engaged.
Wow.
So the hangman, on the night of the execution, executed a civilian also, who had nothing to do with this.
Right.
It so happens that he was up for execution.
Now, was all of this front page news? Because there's a lot of sensational revelations happening, not to mention the unusual nature of an execution, a mass execution.
It did make the front pages, but there was less and less interest as you move further away from the war.
Yeah.
So I don't remember which trial it was I was writing about, but the news of the trial was now on page 14 next to Sam's Groceries Apple sale.
Mm-hmm.
Quite literally bumping up against it. I mean, this is the story. Now, in terms of the homosexuality, you have to read between the lines with a fine-tooth comb to find any reference. There were a couple of very anodyne references, but this is 1946, and it's so the reading about the trials in the press, which I cover, and reading about the trials in the trials is very different. So the thumb kissing episode doesn't make it in.
Right.
I think that story put it as that there was some questions about taking an oath on the Bible. I mean, something like that. So remember, these are morning newspapers. The children are around, so none of the stuff made it in to the newspaper stories. They were, and as I said, the trials start during the Nuremberg trials, which are much bigger.
Right.
Certainly.
So, they made the front page the odd time, but usually you're looking at page 3, page 14, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel, having written so many books about war, that you're seeing the best of humanity or the worst of humanity?
In terms of the best of humanity, I can tell you a little story about a man who was in the Battle of the St. Lawrence, my first book, Ian Tate, and then he was a sub-lieutenant, then he rose to become the executive officer on HMCS Valleyfield. And HMCS Valleyfield was torpedoed, and he and the other exec officer were the last 2 men off. In fact, they swam up as the superstructure sank, they swam up.
Mm.
And they when Ian he fell, he was in his 90s, fell, hit his head, and was dying. His son, whom I spoke to, said to me that I said, Dad, are you in pain? And he said no. And he said, I've had a good life. I'm your mother, your brother, whatever. He says, and I lived, and the men in the Valley Field didn't.
Mm.
So in that sense, yes, some of the best of humanity. And the, just another story about Ian. They were on the valley. They were before sunk, obviously. They're on the battlefield in the middle of the Atlantic, and the senior non-com, he was had to watch, and he was over. Ian was relieving him, and the senior non-com went down to his bunk, and suddenly there's a door knocking on the door, and he opens the door, senior non-com, and there's Ian and 8 other men with doilies pinned to their head.
Mhm.
And this guy's Jewish, which is important to the story. Looks at them and says, "What are you guys doing?" He goes, "Where else are you going to find a minion in the middle of the North Atlantic? So you need the 10 Jewish men to pray."
Right.
So in that sense, you do see the best of humanity, and that also includes dealing with prisoners, and you also see the worst. War is. I had a copy editor for one of my books, and I was screaming and yelling at the copy editing. And at one point, I'm describing a bayonet, what a bayonet does, and it's important for the story. And she put it out, and I wrote "stet," and she wrote, "War, it's icky," and I wrote, "War is icky."
It's icky, yeah.
So you run into both. I will say something I think that's very important, which I'm also seeing in the sense of in Ukraine. And I've written 11 long articles on Ukraine for University World News. My work is recognized across Ukraine. People I don't know send me emails thanking me for what I'm writing about universities being destroyed. My last one was about kidnapped and tortured Ukrainian prisoners, prisoners who were kidnapped by the Russians and tortured. None of the men and women, I've written about women in the Second World War II in the Navy. None of the men or women that I've wrote about, many of whom you and I would probably use the word hero to describe, ever used that term to describe themselves. In the Battle of a book I wrote on Battle of Hong Kong, I was interviewing a guy, and he was telling me, I said, I knew that there was a stream and there was a guy on his right and a guy on his left. I knew that his part of the stream, tall guy, which helped, but his part of the stream was much wider. How did you get across? Because they're under machine gun fire. And spent about 20 minutes telling me about Joe. And I finally said, I know about Joe. I interviewed Joe. I want to know about you. He goes, oh, no, he had it much worse.
Right.
So in that sense, I think you're also seeing, as you say, the best of humanity. These are not terms that it's not terms of the Ukrainian soldiers that I know of, and Ukrainian civilians use. Somebody else may use it about that person over there, but they never use it about themselves. And the Canadians in the Second World War that I've interviewed in Bomber Command in Hong Kong and elsewhere were never used the term, which I find quite interesting.
Very.
It is. We have about a minute left, but I am curious. I mean, this was the last, you call it the last mass execution in Canada. And again, I just want to stress it's in Medicine Hat, which was about the size of a POW camp. How was the execution received in Medicine Hat? And was there any long-term effect of having POW camp there on the city?
The executions were actually in Lethbridge, but the answer to your question is no. Not that I could see. Nothing. It didn't seem to have much impact. I mean, becomes part of civic law, LORE.
Right.
stories, but nothing that I could determine as a. And I interviewed several of the people who were there, who witnessed the trials. A couple of they've all passed on, but and several of the RCMP officers who involved, and nothing that it was identifiable.
Right.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
It was wartime, and people
Right.
segregated things differently than we would do today.
Right. That's
In-
true, actually.
in Canada.
Oh, well, this has been very fascinating, and we're so delighted to have you, Nathan, on the show. Again, the book is Hanged in Medicine Hat. Nathan Greenfield is an expert on military history, the author of 7 books, an international correspondent, and a PhD professor, and the list goes on. Thank you, Nathan, for taking the time to chat with us.
Thank you for listening to me. It's a pleasure.
All right. Until next week, I will be tackling another topic that's actually close to World War II. And we hope you tune in again on Tuesday at noon Eastern. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.